Welcome to the Werewolf Den, where we do a deep dive into the core concepts and principles behind White Wolf's Werewolf the Apocalypse.
I'm Amelin.
And I am Ryan. Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about something a little different from our usual repartee. We have a lot of listeners who aren't primary werewolf fans.
Mm-hmm. A whole lot of you.
And we're super glad to have you along for the ride. But kind of thinking with that audience in mind, we wanted to look at ways to incorporate werewolf NPCs into your other splat. If you're running vampire, how to wisely incorporate werewolves, if you're running wraith, that sort of stuff. In doing this, I want to come from the perspective of, I love werewolf. And if I am playing in a different splat, I don't want to see werewolf come in and be shat upon. And oftentimes, especially in my LARP experiences, that's what I find. Is someone will throw out a werewolf NPC, and it's a bonar, and it's not well thought out, and it doesn't make sense, and it's just sort of there to be different, and it just frustrates me, and sucks me out of the game I'm playing in.
The general way I like to explain this to folks is everybody has their favorite system. Everybody has their favorite splat. And those games are somebody's favorite, probably for very deep and personal reasons. And whether or not those reasons actually are deep and personal, it's not up to you to judge. And you want to be respectful to what's important to people. You want to be respectful to what's important to your players. So a lot of the rules we're going to give for this are honestly going to apply to all the splats. We're just approaching it from a werewolf perspective.
Mm-hmm. And you also want to be respectful to the splat you're running, right? Mm-hmm. If you're running vampire, then having a Nosferatu information broker is a lot more respectful to vampire and to werewolf than having a Bonar information broker show up and talk to your vampire PCs. So, yeah. Want to respect all the splats, the one you're running, and werewolf as well.
Mm-hmm.
To keep things simple, we've got 3 main rules to center all of this around.
We got plenty of examples to back up those things. Oh, yes, we do.
Yes.
But when we kind of made the list, we kind of realized that everything more or less fell into one of these 3 categories. And vampire, we're going to pick on you a little bit. Mostly that's because mathematically you're the most popular game, and it's kind of like the supposed statistic out there that Christians are the most persecuted people. Mathematically you're the largest group, so that's going to happen. But it also has to do with, there is something unique to vampire that is going to apply to one of these subcategories. And that's what we like to call the underworld effect.
This idea that werewolves are antagonistic.
Mm-hmm.
That they're going to fight you. They're going to chew you up and claw you and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And in the underworld movies, they do that, right? They fight the vampires, and the vampires fight them, and then everybody's sexy. Ugh.
Well, I'm not certain how everybody being sexy has to apply to this, but
I don't know. Talking about those movies.
Yeah.
That's my main takeaway.
Essentially, it's one of those things where one of the things that both of us have noticed is whenever we interact with the larger World of Darkness space, there's this meme out there that werewolves hate everyone and are just chronically fighting everyone. And it's like, werewolves are chronically fighting the world? There's actually very little reinforcing that there's something special about you in particular,
right.
Vampires, that reinforces that. There's a couple of little lore bit stuff, like per se with the Silent Striders, which we'll get to, but overall, there's actually very little lore in the books themselves that reinforce this notion of vampires are default antagonists to werewolves that doesn't come from the perspective of vampires are doing some fucked up shit right now that justifiably is pissing off the werewolves.
Right. This brings us to our second point. Werewolves care about stuff. Werewolves aren't going to fight you because you're a vampire. They're going to fight you because you're anti-environmentalist. You're a bigot. You're a colonizer. You're a 1%er. That they have reasons to fight you. And it's not whatever is at the top of your character sheet, whether that's Vampire the Masquerade or what have you. It's what that character does that makes werewolves. And sometimes it's just some werewolves not like you. Other werewolves might think you're groovy. So yeah, remembering that these NPCs, these werewolf NPCs, care about things. And that's where they should glomp onto this. That vampire can be great, or they can be terrible. Or they can be who gives a fuck.
Yep. More or less, this rule we kind of drive into in particular, because when we say werewolves care about stuff, like, very frequently storytellers will just glom onto, like, one or two ideas of, like, the environment is what they care about, and end up making NPCs that do not reinforce and bolster their players in the process. And when you frame it like that, that's the problem. But then, moving then on, that reinforces then our next big problem, which we like to call the glass menagerie effect.
The idea that you're introducing this werewolf because it's different. It's not a Nosferatu information broker, it's a Shadow Lord. Mm-hmm. Isn't that special? Isn't that fancy? It's boring.
Yeah.
It's disrespectful to Vampire because you're not using the tools that Vampire has. Specifically, Nosferatu are this. Mm-hmm. Whereas Bonars and Shadow Lords...
they're not necessarily just that. And so it's disrespectful to utilize them in your game just for that, when it's not reinforcing your themes, and it's also not bolstering your players. Mm-hmm. It's bolstering your ego as a storyteller.
Right. Vampire players are going to know about the Nosferatu, at least to some extent, and they'll understand how to interact with other vampires. But when you throw out something wacky and a werewolf or whatever, like, that disjoints that connection. It might be that those players have no idea what that thing is, and it's a good chance their characters have no idea what that is. And so it's sort of like a glass menagerie toy. You've put it in your cabinet of curios, and everyone can see how special and neat it is, but don't touch it, because it's going to interact in its own way. You can't interact with it, it's just going to talk at you.
If your players can't touch it, then there's no point in introducing it. That is one of my hardcore core rules. And when you introduce anything that is outside of the setting, you risk the glass menagerie effect. And there's a lot of work you need to do as a storyteller to avoid that.
Mm-hmm. So, with those rules out of the way, I want to start with an example that encompasses all of these points. A few months ago, we drew attention to a local cause that we've been dealing with.
Bilbo Prairie.
Yes, we're one of the most pristine and rare types of prairie in the world. There's like 150 acres of it. A good chunk of that is situated right next to the Rockford Airport. And the Rockford Airport has, obviously with the pandemic, been getting a lot of shipping in. And so there's a call to expand the airport. And the Board of Trustees has said, yeah, we're going to just pave over that fucking prairie. Fuck it. We need the shipping. Because Amazon packages are getting bottled up and backed up and everything's fucked. Mm-hmm. So yes, using this as an example of how werewolves can be introduced. I mean, this is perfect for, like, vampire, but the general pattern you can see can work. Werewolves should be utilized as kind of like a seasoning for anything that humanity acts on. If your PCs do something that would get humans to react to it, to care about it, to hate it, whatever, werewolves are a perfect seasoning in that. So if you've got a Ventru, let's say, who's got a lot of influence in transportation and industry and wants to expand to this airport to make more money, they're doing that, right? Well, human society is reacting. There are protests, there are petitions, people are going to town hall meetings and board of trustee meetings and complaining and writing to their politicians and all of that shit. A Ventru, with all of their supernatural powers and whatnot, should have no problem just bowling over humans that try and resist them, right? But you can sprinkle in some werewolves into that. Mm-hmm. But you do it slowly, right? It's not just your Ventru decides to do this and then werewolves roll in on Elysium. But showcase an escalation of drama in this case. Those protests, yeah, they're going really well. There's a lot of fire behind them. There's even some scary fucking people who might have showed up to one of those board of trustee meetings, right?
There's a guy sitting in front of one of the bulldozers. Nobody wants to get in that fucking bulldozer. It's like, that bulldozer could probably plow over that guy. You look at the video and it's like, why? Just plow over him. I'll cover the part. And the person's like, no, I don't want to get near that guy. Hi, Curse of Rage. Mm-hmm.
Have all of these little difficulties because the werewolves are going to act against the problem at hand. Right? The bulldozing of this prairie. They're not going to seek out immediately this vampire. There's no reason for them to think there's a vampire behind it to start with. They're reactionary, and they care about stuff. They're going to fight the paving over of this pristine landscape. Then you throw it back to your player. All right, we've had these problems. Some of the Board of Trustee members are being kind of intimidated by these people. They're still moving along. You know, some of the crew that work the construction trucks and whatnot, they're a little afraid to keep doing this. Do you want to keep moving along?
They're threatening forming a union because pay so far ain't worth this shit.
Right. You going to keep pushing it? Okay, you keep pushing it. The werewolves are going to react more viscerally because the problem hasn't stopped. So, you know what? They kidnap one of the board of trustee members now. And your ghoul reports back to you that, Mrs. Collins received a package in the mail. And Mr. Thompson's toe was in that box. And there's this letter that looks like it was written by Charles Manson with all the, individual letters cut out of magazine covers and shit. And it says that you better fucking stop this or things are going to get worse and they're going to escalate. And there's some demands. You should listen to these protesters who've said that, you can expand airport shipping by 5% and leave the prairie intact. Or you can go with your plan and fuck over the prairie and not have any shipping problems. But what are you going to do now? You're escalating that drama and you're giving the player the opportunity to either kowtow to the werewolves' demands or to oppose them. And if they oppose them, well, now the werewolves are going to take it a step further. Your ghoul is going to report back to the board of trustees and say, fuck it, get it done, make it happen. Well, the werewolves are going to kidnap another one. And they're going to interrogate that person. And that board of trustee member is going to report back that the ghoul that you have, that's the power behind the curtain, they're pushing this. And so you need to get them. And so now the werewolves are aware of one of your direct contacts. And they're going to come for that person if you don't do something to stop them. And we're escalating that drama, right? This is happening over at least a session, probably 2 or 3, where, again, the player has the opportunity to, well, now my ghoul's in danger. Do I pull them out? And do I let the board of trustees just get murdered? Do I put my ghoul at risk and keep pushing this? Do I show up and make myself, a part of this chain of connection that the werewolves can follow towards? Or do I capitulate at this point? Do I think this is getting too severe and I'm just going to let the environmentalists have it? There's all sorts of ways to build this drama without just having werewolves pop up out of nowhere, because that just feels cheap and silly.
That's what we like to call treating your werewolves like orcs.
Right. These werewolves care about stuff. And if the player character changes their mind and cares about the things the werewolves care about, then there's no conflict.
This also gives your players agency to decide their own morality, because maybe they didn't know about Spellbowl Prairie as an actual environmental thing because nothing on their sheet tells them that they are ecologically aware. Nothing within their contacts would even bring this up as a problem. The problem is, people are not getting the packages or the shipments that they need in order to get by in the world right now. Or the economy in my town is stalling out because I'm not able to export a major thing out because I can't do it at a fast enough rate that my business partners are happy with me or something like that. There's ways that you can pinch the player to put them in this gray situation where they have to really think about what they're doing with this. And it's not necessarily just a complete black and white thing. And you give your players an option to be a complete bastard with this, or just doing their best to try to even find a potential ally. And that's the other good thing with this scenario. A lot of people talk about how they don't care for the werewolf antagonists to vampire thing either. And then, of course, they dump werewolves in as an antagonist into their system as just orc-style antagonists without actually thinking about how to properly weave them into your story. And when you do that in a way that centers your player's action as opposed to centering your setting's appeal, you actually are far more likely to get a satisfying setup where you have that werewolf vampire allyship or whatever you want to do that feels more authentic and real at that point. Because if you just do it as a pre-established thing, that gives your players no agency to really act on it.
Right.
That gives your players not a whole lot to do to react to that thing. It's just a thing now. And players have plenty of means to bring in pre-established relationships so that they can have, a buddy that's a werewolf or things like that. But those are like merits, and those are things that you can sit down and talk about with the player so that you can weave that into your setting more organically. It's not something that you are forcing onto your players when they probably just don't care. They didn't design their characters to be these great allies. You can direct them towards that way by introducing werewolves this way, and then they feel like they accomplish something.
Mm-hmm. Another important thing to keep in mind with werewolves is that because they care about stuff, they would view themselves as being the protagonists of their own story, right?
Mm-hmm.
And with a lot of the things that Werewolf grapples with, there's no easy answer to it. And so you can take things where your player characters are making choices that they rationalize as being good, and you can find ways to make a werewolf an antagonist in that situation who also thinks they're doing the right thing. If you have a vampire whose feeding style is to feed from, let's say, patients in a hospice care center, where they've only got a couple weeks or maybe just a couple days left of life, and you're going to drain all their blood and put them out of their misery, and it's viewed in a humane fashion.
A Fianna might look at that and be like, good on you.
Whereas a child of Gaia might look at that and go, you are taking this person before their time. And even if they're just sitting in a fucking bed for 99% of it, Timmy and Suzanne might have been coming over in 3 days to see their grandmother one last time. And you killed them, you monster. And so you can have these opportunities where, again, you're taking a player choice, right? A player chose, my feeding style is I eat people in hospice. And I think it's a good thing. Look at my humanity score. And then you can take a werewolf who cares about stuff and make an antagonist in that fashion. It's not just dumb underworld crap. There's a reason for this. If a human would be offended by this, a werewolf can be offended by this. And so you're just escalating that vampires versus humans, giving them a couple supernatural powers on the side kind of thing.
Yep. And then boiling into this kind of rolls into one of the big key things that frustrates me to no end, but is so common, which is this notion that when you're trying to figure out, okay, what werewolves are allies, what werewolves are antagonists for my setting, people always go, well, it's this tribe and this tribe, and it typically divides along the lines of urban werewolves, allies, rural werewolves, antagonists?
There are these weird stereotypes, yeah. Like, even the books will say that Bonars and Shadow Lords will slum around with vampires, and they're okay with being around unscrupulous types.
Kind of, sort of. Here's the catch with that, though. Shadow Lords do it because they can accomplish something with that allegiance. A Shadow Lord isn't going to bum around with you if you are useless to him.
Right. And if you do bad things, again, that's what a werewolf is going to care about. This book's assumption that Bonars and Nosferatu get along doesn't make any fucking sense. If that Nosferatu is a 1%er, fuck you. If that Nosferatu feeds on rats in the sewers, fuck you. Like, there's all sorts of player choices.
Bonars and Nosferatu tend to get along not because they hang around in sewers and are super urban or something like that. They do it because they both tend to come from the quote-unquote dregs of society. They are the outcasts that cannot function in a highly capitalistic society that demands that beauty actually means something. Like, that's why they get along. It's not because they both happen to be quote-unquote information brokers. It's because there are thematic overlays, not just aesthetic ones. And that plays into that whole, like, don't be a glass menagerie thing. If your werewolf shows up just because you're like, oh, I can point to this section of this one sentence in a book that says it's potentially okay, you still need to expand on that. You need to have a comprehensive setting. Why is that werewolf there? Why does he care? You need to treat all your NPCs like this. If they're just there to be cool, then your players are going to look at that and be like, well, I can't really touch or interact with that except, in the ways that the storyteller is giving me very, 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 very obvious cues for.
Another problem with the Glass Menagerie is that it's often ham-fisted as well. I've watched a lot of streams where oh, you need to know that this NPC is a werewolf, and so they're in Krynos form. So that way you know exactly what they are. And they're going to tell you that they're a werewolf, and these are their, they have auspices and and why? Why are they doing this? And how can a player interact with, it just feels like it exists purely to show off how neat and special it is.
It exists for storyteller ego, not for player interaction, and that's why it's frustrating.
So yeah, that slow burn is a great way to avoid that pitfall. Where the werewolf isn't going to show up and go into Krynos and be like, I'm a werewolf and you're being bad to the environment and that's why I don't like you. Yeah, you're going to tell just by the way they react to what you are doing. If you're being anti-environmentalist, yeah, you'll kind of get the point of what they're about without knowing what they are. And that's what matters.
And if you want to, drop those hints, your vampire players have tools to figure that out. You can emphasize the curse of rage affecting the player character's ghouls. You can emphasize on letting somebody have, their auspice checks or something like that. There's always a player that has, a great depth library or resource to knowledge sort of thing.
A bunch of auspics,
Yeah. Let them utilize that. That, again, empowers the players without you as the storyteller beating them over the head with your dick, basically.
And even for the meta-analysts out of character, it's kind of fun to look at those NPCs and go, is that a Black Fury? Did they care about that pristine environment? Is that or maybe they're a Red Talon?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And to sort of, kind of...
It's fun for players to speculate.
Yes.
Let them.
Making it super obvious is kind of boring.
Yeah. You know what's super fun? Let them speculate. Is that a changeling or a werewolf? I don't know. That's fun. Let them speculate.
Oh, and in terms of talking about the tools that are available to werewolves, oftentimes, like we've said with this example of they're used as orcs or kobolds in D&D, where it's just they're a bunch of strong boys and they roll up and they punch and bite and kick and stuff and they're really strong in a fight. And that's kind of boring as well. One of the cool things about werewolves is that they work in groups, in packs. If you want, you can even say that they're connected to a sept, and so there's even more power behind it, but honestly that might be a little too much, and with werewolves being so outnumbered, it kind of goes against their theme as well. But every single member of that pack is their own individual. They're very multi-dimensional. You have your strong boys, but you also have your skullduggeries, and you have your influence mongers, and yeah, you've got people who can handle a lot of different problems from different directions. And so you don't just have to use werewolves as strong boys that fight the people with potence and celerity. No, they can wield influence with the Ventru. They can engage in social media campaigns and try and smear the Toreador. They can do all sorts of things.
To further compound onto this, it also gets rid of this notion that we were kind of alluding to before with this whole urban versus rural, which one's allies, which one's antagonists with tribes, because very rarely in packs is it just one tribe in the pack. So you can have this diversity of, well, it's the Glasswalker that found you, but this Glasswalker has access to a Black Fury, a Bonar, a Child of Gaia, and a Get a Fenris. Have fun with that. And it also gets rid of some very bad, unfortunate habits that players have that I feel like is one of those reinforces racism and other isms sort of thing, because guess which tribes happen to fall into that, it's rule, so it's antagonists very frequently. Younger Brother's a big popular one. So are Red Talons. Oy. So many people want to have their Magneto and don't know how to write a good Magneto. Don't just use a tribe. Make a pack. That's going to be more authentic to your setting anyway, and it's going to be much more interesting for your players to interact and deal with.
And again, yeah, what choices did the players make to create these antagonists?
To create these allies. To create these NPCs in general, werewolves are best utilized as something reacting to what the players do. They shouldn't be prescriptively put into your setting, because power creep is a thing, and chances are, particularly with vampire, you piss off a werewolf, and in actuality, what should happen is everything that interacted with that werewolf should die. But when you have it be this multifaceted pack instead of just a tribe that you're dealing with, you give your players more options to actually do something about it.
To kind of break with vampire a bit, werewolf has something to offer for pretty much every splat. In fact, you have the Fianna, who deal very regularly with the changelings, and you have the Silent Striders, who are primely situated to interact with wraiths. And something I would caution about this is that the way those are presented is obviously for player characters of werewolves, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're playing a Fianna, the books are like, hey, changelings, they're a thing you can have a relationship with. Oh, cool. If you're a storyteller, there's a major pitfall that you have to watch out for, and really that's any splat, is if I'm playing anything, vampire, mage, wraith, what have you, I do not want to see a werewolf come in, or anything from outside of my splat, and know more about my condition than I do, or than NPCs.
Or even just as much, really.
Yes.
This is another huge problem that comes from kind of the glass menagerie effect a little bit. It's when storytellers look at the book and they're like so excited about this cool new thing. And they're like, oh, I want to show it off and I want to tell you all about it. And here's my lectern and here's the book. But I'm just going to tell it to you as exposition.
It's just a Fianna preaching to you about stag and changelings, but you're a changeling. Get the fuck out of here.
Yeah. Nothing is more annoying when
Werewolf-splaining.
Yeah. Nothing is more annoying when I am a werewolf and a mage comes up to me and explains to me how werewolves work. Don't do that to any other system.
Mm-hmm. And to be honest, that in a sense kind of makes them the most precarious to utilize. With vampire, because you're dealing with humanity so much, it's very, very easy to find ways to, alright, here's a good way to introduce werewolves. But with wraith especially, and also with changeling, you've kind of got to be careful, because
the werewolves are there to solve your problems in a lot of those cases.
Right. They're there with this theological idea that they can help. And that can sort of be a problem. You especially don't want to overshadow your players in this instance, right? If they're going to be allies, they should be doing something kind of tangentially or off on the side, or even if they're on the same field of fucking battle, yeah, you're just sort of narrating what they're doing to help, but the players should still be doing the thing, right? And that can be one of the most difficult things to deal with. I think, again, sort of going back to that slow burn idea, that's a good way to avoid those sorts of problems. If you slow build in a Wraith game, that, first off, there's someone that you can see you. And when you talk, it's clear they hear, like, okay, here's someone you can actually intermediate with, right? You're giving the player the tools to interact with this NPC, which is important. And then you can demonstrate that this person is an ally and let the players sort of dictate what they can do. So that way your Silent Strider doesn't come off like they know better or they know what you need. But as someone who is, from Owl's perspective, I should be helping you. You are caught in a cycle of misery. You need to move on to what awaits. We need a final death for you. How can I help? Tell me what you need. Okay, one of your fetters is in danger. That's something I can help with. You tell me what you need. You don't have puppetry, you don't have the ability to interact with objects on the material. I do. Tell me what you need. You need this thing moved? Like, give the players the opportunity to sort of direct that. If you're changelings and a Fianna shows up, great. Let the players pick how to utilize that. Because just being a fighty guy, well, we have trolls for that. Like, if you're playing Lost, we have Summer Court for that. Like, don't just be there to be special. Have something that lets the players use you in an interesting way to build a story. And if you don't have anything like that, use the troll. Use the Summer Court. Use something from the setting. Because
at the very least, if nothing else, you as the storyteller, you are running this system probably because you're more familiar with it. You're running Vampire because you're more familiar with it and you prefer it. You're running Changeling because you're more familiar with it and you prefer it. You're bringing in Werewolf. Chances are, 9 times out of 10, people that bring it in from outside don't actually know a whole lot about it. And then I have had so many instances with so many different people where I have to be like, okay, no, well, yes, kinda, no, you have a memeified idea of what's going on, but you don't have the whole picture, and that just becomes frustrating for everyone, because it's frustrating to me, because then I have to spend a whole bunch of time educating you when there's podcasts like ours out there, or there's books out there, and there's plenty of other resources for you as the storyteller to do the research yourself, and it's like, I'm doing your work for you. And I'm your player. I want to do my player work, not your storyteller work. So I think, for the most part, like, we could probably go a little bit more in depth with it, with the various different examples, but I think we've covered the big ones. Hopefully with this, you should have every tool you need to interconnect Werewolf into Vampire game, into your Changeling game, or into your Mage game, or, you know, any other spec. Because, again, a lot of these rules apply to any sort of Monster Mash setup.
Very true.
And hopefully you found this informative. Always, rule number 1, be respectful to your players and be respectful to what's important to them.
Mm-hmm.
And when people give you critique, like, hey, you know, don't just incorporate the bone gnar because it's cool and unique, understand where they're coming from.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Have a good one.